She was only 19 years old when she was shot in the head. 3 bullets, fired in her own apartment in the middle of the night. A night that should have been filled with Christmas joy instead ended in blood and silence. It was December 1986. The holiday season was in full swing. Families were laughing, kids were playing with toys. The streets glowed with lights and music. Everyone seemed caught in the warmth of the season. But behind one apartment door, happiness had been replaced with horror. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, a call came into police dispatch. Shots fired. Officers rushed to the complex, sirens cutting through the quiet winter air. Detective Tommy Lee was one of the first to arrive. He climbed the narrow stairwell to the second floor, not knowing what he was about to face. When he pushed open the door, the sight froze him. On the floor lay a young woman, her body limp, her face covered in blood. She had been shot execution style 3 times in the head. Her name was Karen Mert. She was just 19. The air in that apartment was heavy, filled with the smell of gunpowder and tragedy. For Lee, it wasn't just another crime scene. It was personal. Then came the moment that would haunt him for the rest of his career. As he stood over Karen's body, a woman suddenly rushed into the apartment. It was her mother. She demanded answers, begged to know what had happened. Lee had to look her straight in the eyes and say the words no parent should ever hear. "Your daughter is dead." She collapsed into his arms, crying out in agony. For police officers, there's no training that prepares you for moments like that. You carry them for life. For Karen's family, the news was unbearable. Their daughter was gone, taken in an instant by someone she trusted. But as devastating as that night was, this story would take a shocking turn. Because Karen's case wasn't just about a young woman murdered by obsession. It would become a story where tragedy collided with fate, where the end of one life gave birth to the survival of another. This is not just a murder case. This is the story of how love turned to control, how obsession turned to violence, and how one heart, Karen's heart, refused to stop beating, even after her death. To understand the tragedy, we have to step back and look at Karen's life before that night. She was 19, bright, full of energy, the kind of girl who made people smile just by being around. She was just starting to step into adulthood, figuring out who she was and what she wanted from life. But like many teenagers, she got caught up in a romance that seemed exciting at first, but soon turned dangerous. His name was Mert. To the outside world, he seemed like the kind of boyfriend a young woman might be proud to have, older, attentive, maybe even protective. At the beginning, Karen felt chosen. She thought she'd found someone who cared deeply for her. But what looked like love quickly turned into something else. Mark wasn't just protective. He was possessive. If another man looked at Karen for a second too long, he noticed. If she laughed at someone's joke or smiled at a friend, he questioned her. It wasn't sweet. It was controlling. And when he drank, things only got worse. Alcohol fed his paranoia. It made him moody, angry, sometimes even threatening. Karen started to realize she wanted more. She wanted a love that made her feel safe, not trapped. Friends would later recall how she longed for something normal, something free of jealousy and pain. So she tried to leave. She tried to explain to Mark that the relationship was over. She did it kindly, hoping he would accept it and move on. But Mark didn't see it that way. To him, Karen wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his possession, and the thought of losing her made him spiral. Obsessive love can turn into something very dark. And with Mark, that's exactly what happened. He wasn't willing to let go. Instead of walking away, he clung harder. His emotions twisted into rage. Karen's rejection wasn't just painful, it was unbearable. What began as a teenage romance had become a ticking time bomb. Karen's choice to walk away should have given her freedom. Instead, it would set the stage for the violence that took her life. It was the early morning hours of December 28, 1986. Christmas decorations still glowed in the windows of the apartment complex. The world outside was calm, peaceful. Inside, though, the storm had already begun. Karen had been clear with Mark. She didn't want to get back together. She had said it gently at first, then firmly. "We're through," she told him. I'm not going to put up with your jealousy anymore. But to Mark, those words weren't an ending. They were a trigger. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting, the sound of voices raised in anger. Then, suddenly, 3 deafening cracks ripped through the night. Gunshots. At about 2:30 a.m., a frantic call came into the police station. Officers rushed to the scene. Detective Tommy Lee was the first to step inside. He moved up to the second floor, opened the door, and froze. Karen was on the ground. Blood pooled around her head. She had been shot 3 times, execution style. 19 years old, her life ended in seconds. Lee later described the scene as something he would never forget. And then came the moment that cut even deeper. Karen's mother arrived, desperate, searching for her daughter. Lee had no choice but to tell her the truth. Her daughter had been murdered. The woman collapsed in his arms, crying out in disbelief. Mark wasn't at the scene, but suspicion fell on him immediately. He had a history of jealousy, of drinking, of threatening behavior. Friends had heard him say he couldn't live without Karen. Now, with her body lying cold on the apartment floor, those words carried a much darker meaning. For Karen, the love she once thought was special had ended in violence. She had wanted freedom, independence, and the chance to live her life. Instead, she was silenced by the very person who claimed to love her most. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because even though Karen's life was stolen, her heart, literally, was not done beating. Detectives didn't have to look far for a suspect. Everyone close to Karen knew the truth. Mark had been spiraling. He couldn't handle her rejection. He drank, grew paranoid, and followed her every move. Friends told police about his controlling nature, how he'd question her if she so much as smiled at another man. They painted a picture of a young woman desperate to break free from someone who saw her not as a partner, but as property. Investigators collected what they could from the apartment. 3 shell casings, signs of a violent confrontation, and, most importantly, motive. Mark's obsession wasn't hidden. It was public. People had witnessed it, Karen herself had spoken about it, and now it had escalated into murder. For her family, those first days after her death were unbearable. Christmas decorations still hung in the house, but they were surrounded by grief. Instead of laughter, there was silence. Instead of celebration, there were funeral arrangements. Karen's mother would later say she couldn't process it, that part of her still expected to see her daughter walk through the door. But while one family was drowning in sorrow, another story was unfolding that no one could have predicted. Across town, in a hospital, a woman named Eva was dying. Her heart was failing fast. Doctors warned that without a transplant, she wouldn't survive. Every day was a gamble and time was running out. Then came news that a donor heart was available. It was strong, young, perfect match. Surgeons moved quickly, preparing Eva for a risky, groundbreaking surgery. Her family prayed as doctors wheeled her into the operating room. And there, for the first time in history, a living, beating heart was transplanted into another person. That heart belonged to Karen. Even though her life had ended in violence, her heart gave Eva a second chance at life. One family's tragedy had become another family's miracle. The case of Karen Mert was no longer just about a murder. It had become a story about fate, science, and the strange ways life and death can collide. When the case finally reached the courtroom, the outcome seemed almost certain. The prosecution laid out the story with chilling clarity. They showed the jury how Mark's relationship with Karen had shifted from affection to obsession. They painted him as a young man who couldn't handle rejection, whose jealousy had turned violent, and whose control had spiraled into murder. Witness after witness spoke about Karen's attempts to end things peacefully. Friends described how she tried to explain to Mark that it was over, that she needed to move on. But instead of letting her go, he stalked her, questioned her, and smothered her with paranoia. His drinking only made him more unstable. The prosecution argued that on that December night, Mark made a final, terrible choice. If he couldn't have Karen, no one would. The defense had little ground to stand on. They tried to humanize him, to suggest this was the act of a heartbroken young man who lost control. But that argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. This wasn't just a moment of passion. It was execution. 3 bullets to the head. A calculated act meant to end a life. The jury didn't deliberate long. They returned with a verdict. Guilty. Mark was convicted of murder. For Karen's family, it was a small measure of justice. Nothing could bring her back. Nothing could erase the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a friend. But hearing that word, guilty, was at least an acknowledgement of the truth. As the sentence was handed down, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. On one side, Karen's family wept, their grief mixed with relief. On the other, Mark faced the consequences of his obsession. His actions had destroyed not just Karen's life, but his own. The trial closed one chapter of the story, but Karen's heart was still beating. Inside Eva, the woman whose life had been saved by the transplant. That strange, almost impossible twist made this case unlike any other. It was a story of love gone wrong, justice served, and a heart that carried on. For Karen's family, the guilty verdict didn't heal the wound. Holidays were never the same. Each Christmas, they were reminded not of joy, but of the night their daughter was taken. They carried the weight of her absence through every birthday, every family gathering, every milestone she never reached. Karen would never walk down the aisle. She would never become a mother. Her story was frozen at 19. But out of that darkness came a thread of light. In the hospital, Eva recovered. The surgery had been a gamble. At the time, heart transplantation was still experimental, uncertain, and terrifying. Doctors had never before taken a living, beating heart and placed it inside another human being. But against all odds, Eva survived. Not just survived, she thrived. At first, recovery was fragile. Her body wanted to reject the new heart. Her immune system fought against it. Doctors balanced powerful drugs to keep her alive. Slowly, Eva grew stronger. Days turned into months, months into years. She found herself not only alive, but full of purpose. She began helping others, using her own story to comfort patients who faced similar battles. She told them that things could get better, that even when life felt impossible, hope could still be found. And through it all, she carried Karen's heart. Literally, each beat inside her chest was a reminder that her life had been bought with another's loss. For decades, that heart kept her alive. 5 years became 10, 10 became 30. A young woman's murder had unknowingly given another woman 3 more decades of life. It's hard not to think about the strange symmetry of it all. One life taken by jealousy, another extended by chance. Karen's story is a tragedy, but it is also a reminder of how life and death can collide in ways that defy explanation. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, and in a way, a silent savior. Her heart lived on, and for those who remember her, that means her story didn't truly end that night in 1986.